If you can fit into that dress— Donald Versace raised his whiskey glass toward the chandelier, his voice dripping with cruel amusement as he pointed at the crimson gown. "I'll marry you myself right here in this hall." The explosion of laughter was deafening. 80 guests at the Versace estate, Naples' most powerful crime bosses, corrupt politicians, and old money aristocrats, turned in perfect unison to see who had become their evening's entertainment. Designer gowns rustled, diamond jewelry caught the light, expensive cigars paused mid-draw. Helen Morales, 27 years old, stood frozen near the base of the grand staircase with its ornate wrought iron railing. The silver serving tray in her hands trembled slightly, causing the crystal champagne glasses to clink softly, a delicate sound swallowed instantly by the roar of mockery filling the marble hall. Her navy blue maid uniform with its crisp white collar and apron hung modestly on her curvy frame, practical, professional, designed to make her invisible. Until this moment, it had worked perfectly. Donald Versace, 32 years old and devastatingly handsome in a custom pinstripe suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, laughed that particular laugh of men who'd never faced real consequences. His dark hair was slicked back with precision. His cold gray eyes gleamed with the kind of amusement that came from treating human beings like toys. He gestured dramatically with his whiskey glass, the amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "I'm serious," he shouted to the crowd, playing to them like a performer on a stage. "Someone get me a pen and paper. We'll draw up the contract right now." Two women in elegant designer gowns, his current mistresses, Helen knew from weeks of observation, laughed especially loudly beside him. The one in midnight blue leaned toward her companion and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "Does she even own a mirror? Poor thing." The dress in question hung like a crimson ghost in the center of the grand hall, displayed on a black velvet mannequin under a dedicated spotlight. A Versace original, naturally, valued at 300,000 euros, size 0. Structured bodice that would require a waist measurement. Helen hadn't seen since she was 12. Mermaid silhouette designed for women whose bodies were their full-time jobs, maintained by personal trainers, private chefs, and cosmetic surgeons. A work of art made for people who treated their bodies like investments, not vessels for survival. Helen felt the heat rising from her chest to her neck, tinging her olive-toned Mediterranean skin with a flush that she knew was visible even in the chandelier's golden light. Her dark eyes, her father's eyes, filled with tears that she blinked furiously to hold back. Not here, not in front of them. She'd learned in the 3 months working at this estate that rich people, especially criminal rich people, had a particular talent for turning humiliation into entertainment. It was a sport, a way to remind themselves they were powerful and others were not. In Donald's world, loyalty is everything, and on this channel, it's the same. Join the family, hit subscribe, and stay until the next chapter of power, betrayal, and redemption. "Come on, dear." A woman's voice cut through the laughter. An elderly aristocrat in a gold dress dripping with emeralds. "Accept the proposal. Single billionaire crime lords don't come along every day." More laughter, louder now, feeding on itself. Phone cameras lifted throughout the crowd like digital witnesses. Flashes captured Helen's burning face, her trembling hands, her lowered eyes. This moment would be on private social media within minutes, shared among Italy's elite with mocking captions and laughing emojis. Helen lowered her head, gripped the silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned white, and began to walk. Not run. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Each step toward the service corridor was measured, deliberate, dignified despite everything. Each laugh behind her felt like a physical blow. Each whispered comment reached her ears with perfect clarity. Each camera flash was proof that this humiliation would follow her forever. "Hey, wait!" Donald's voice rang out across the hall, still tinged with that cruel amusement that came so easily to him. Don't run away, sweetheart. The offer stands. 30 days. If you can squeeze into that dress in 30 days, I'll keep my word. We'll have a proper Versace wedding right here. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, as if they were watching a theatrical performance instead of someone's degradation. Someone shouted, I'll bet €100 she doesn't even try. Another voice, I'll take that bet. Desperation makes people do crazy things. Helen didn't look back. She pushed through the service door with her shoulder, and the moment it closed behind her, heavy wood muffling the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses, she leaned against the cold wall of the service hallway. The corridor smelled of lemon cleaner and starch. Stacks of folded linens sat on industrial shelves. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. This was the world behind the world, where the magic happened, where the labor that created luxury remained hidden. Helen set down the tray carefully on a nearby cart. Then she let the tears fall. But something happened in that empty hallway, between the stacks of linens and the smell of cleaning products and the cold concrete floor beneath her practical shoes. Something inside her didn't break. It transformed. The shame began to boil, turning into something else entirely. Anger. Determination. A promise she made to the ghost of her father and to the woman she used to be before everything fell apart. What none of those easily amused guests knew, what Donald Versace especially didn't know, was that Helen Morales wasn't just a maid. 3 years ago, she'd been a third-year law student at the University of Naples Federico II, top of her class, full scholarship, a future in prosecution that her professors said was absolutely guaranteed. She'd been studying criminal law specifically, focused on organized crime, dreaming of the day she could stand in a courtroom and put men like Donald Versace behind bars. Then her father died. Inspector Julio Morales, decorated police investigator, devoted husband, proud father, had spent 2 years building an airtight case against the Versace crime family. Smuggling, money laundering, extortion, murder. He'd gathered evidence that could have dismantled their empire permanently. The night before he was scheduled to testify, his car went off a bridge on a winding road outside Naples. Official report. Brake failure, tragic accident. Helen never believed it. Neither did her mother, Rosa, whose heart literally broke from grief 6 months later, officially listed as cardiac arrest, but Helen knew better. Her mother had died of a broken heart, consumed by the knowledge that justice would never come for the man she'd loved. At 24 years old, Helen had found herself orphaned, drowning in medical bills and funeral costs, her scholarship suspended due to family circumstances, her dreams of becoming a prosecutor seeming impossibly distant. She'd made a choice. She'd falsified her employment records, created a new identity, and applied for a position at the Versace estate as a maid. Got hired through Mady, the head housekeeper who'd worked there for 20 years, and had her own reasons for hating the family. For 3 months, Helen had been gathering evidence, photographing documents, recording conversations, mapping out the organization's structure, following in her father's footsteps, finishing what he'd started. And then came tonight. The gala, the dress, the humiliation she hadn't planned for. But as Helen stood in that service corridor, wiping tears with the back of her hand, straightening her shoulders beneath the modest maid's uniform, she realized something. Donald Versace had just given her the perfect cover. She whispered to the empty hallway, her voice steady despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. 30 days, Donald Versace. But I'm not coming back for marriage. I'm not coming back for your approval. I'm coming back for justice. Her hand moved to the small silver locket hidden beneath her uniform, the one with her father's photo inside, the one she touched every morning before starting her shift, the one that reminded her why she was really here. For you, Papa, she whispered. I'll finish what you started. What Donald Versace also didn't know What he couldn't possibly have known as he laughed with his guests and toasted to his own cleverness was that his innocent joke had just set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything he'd built. Because Helen Morales wasn't planning to come back alone. She had allies he didn't know about, evidence he didn't know existed, and a determination forged in 3 years of grief, rage, and carefully cultivated patience. The countdown had begun. 30 days until the dress. 30 days until the truth. 30 days until the most powerful mafia boss in Naples learned what happened when you humiliated the wrong woman. The servants' quarters occupied the top floor of the East Wing, a cramped attic space with slanted ceilings and 6 narrow beds pushed against walls that still held the summer heat, even at midnight. Helen climbed the back stairs slowly, her legs heavy with exhaustion that wasn't entirely physical. The humiliation played on repeat in her mind. Donald's cruel smile, the explosion of laughter, the cameras capturing her shame for eternity. But beneath the shame, something else burned. Something that had been building for 3 years, since the night the police knocked on her apartment door with news about her father's accident. 3 years ago, Helen had been someone else entirely. A third-year law student at the University of Naples Federico II, specializing in criminal prosecution with a focus on organized crime. Top of her class, full scholarship. Her professors had called her relentless and brilliant, destined for the prosecutor's office, maybe even national politics someday. Inspector Julio Morales had been so proud. Her father had spent 2 decades in law enforcement, the last 2 years of his life building an ironclad case against the Versace crime family. Smuggling operations running through the Naples port. Money laundering through legitimate businesses. Extortion networks spanning southern Italy. He'd gathered evidence methodically, carefully, knowing that men like Carlo Versace, Donald's father, didn't go down without a fight. The night before he was scheduled to testify, his car went off a bridge on the coastal road. Official report: brake failure due to poor maintenance. Tragic accident. Helen had never believed it. Neither had her mother, Rosa, who'd clutched that police report with shaking hands and whispered, "They killed him. They killed my Julio." 6 months later, Rosa's heart simply stopped. Officially cardiac arrest, but Helen knew the truth. Her mother had died of a broken heart, consumed by grief and the bitter knowledge that justice would never come. At 24, orphaned and drowning in medical bills, Helen had made a choice that would have horrified her father. She would finish what he'd started, no matter what it took. She'd falsified her employment records, created a new identity, Elena Russo, orphan from Salerno with no family connections, and applied for a housekeeping position at the Versace estate. Getting hired had been easier than expected, thanks to Maddie. Helen pushed open the servants' quarters door and stopped. Maddie sat on Helen's bed, still wearing her black housekeeper's dress, her graying hair pulled back in its customary bun. At 45, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite 20 years of serving a family that treated her like furniture. "I saw what he did tonight," Maddie said quietly, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "And I'm done watching that family destroy good people." Helen closed the door carefully, glancing at the other beds. Empty, the other staff still cleaning up after the gala. "Maddie, my daughter was 19. Maddie's voice was steady, but her eyes held old pain. "Lucia, beautiful, smart, studying to be a nurse. Donald's cousin Stefano. He assaulted her at a family party 5 years ago." Helen's breath caught. "When I tried to report it, the Versaces paid off the police. Made my Lucia take a psychiatric evaluation. Said she was unstable, delusional. They had her committed to a facility for 6 months." Maddie's hands clenched. "She's never been the same. Can't hold a job. Has nightmares. That family took my daughter's future and called it protection. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry." Maddie stood, her eyes fierce. "Be ready. Because I have keys to Donald's private study. I know where his father made him hide the real records, the ones that prove everything. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to barely a whisper. "Help me destroy them, and I'll help you get whatever you came here for." Helen's heart hammered. "How did you know? You ask too many questions for a simple maid. You watch everything, and—" Mady touched her own chest. "You wear a locket you think no one sees, but I've seen you touch it every morning like it's a prayer." For a long moment, Helen considered denying everything. Then she slowly pulled the silver locket from beneath her uniform, opened it. Inside was a photo of Inspector Julio Morales in his police uniform, smiling. "He was building a case against the Versaces," Helen whispered. "They killed him the night before he could testify." Mady's eyes filled with recognition. "Morales, 3 years ago. I remember." She reached out and squeezed Helen's hand. "Then we finish what he started. Together." At 2 a.m., while the last guests stumbled to their cars and Donald retired with his mistresses, Mady led Helen through a hidden servants' passage behind the kitchen pantry. The narrow corridor smelled of old wood and dust, lit only by their phone flashlights. They emerged in a section of the mansion Helen had never accessed, the private wing where Donald's study overlooked the gardens. The room was everything Helen had imagined: leather-bound books lining mahogany shelves, and massive desk covered in papers, family portraits watching from every wall. The Versace legacy on display. "The safe is behind the third portrait," Mady whispered. "But there's something else." She moved to the bookshelf, her practiced hands finding a loose panel that swung open silently. Inside lay a leather diary, worn and water-stained. "Valentina Versace's," Mady breathed. "Donald's mother. She died 10 years ago. They said it was suicide, but—" She handed it to Helen. "Read it." Helen's hands trembled as she opened the diary, using her phone light to illuminate pages of elegant Italian script dated months before Valentina's death. She flipped through entries about family dinners, garden parties, mounting concerns about her husband's business. Then one entry stopped her cold. 15. Marzo. I confronted Carlo tonight about the inspector. He laughed, said it was handled, that the man's car had been fixed properly. I asked if Donald knew. His face, Dio mio, his face told me everything. My son helped cover up murder. Donald knows what his father did to that inspector. He helped dispose of evidence, paid off witnesses. My son has become the monster I always feared. God forgive me, I've failed him. I've failed to save his soul." Helen's vision blurred. Her father. Valentina had known about her father's murder. And Donald had been complicit. "Photograph everything," Mady urged. "Every page." With shaking hands, Helen documented the diary, page after page of evidence, of Valentina's growing horror at her family's crimes, of her failed attempts to convince Donald to leave the business, of her final despairing entry 2 days before her death. When they finally returned to the servants' quarters as dawn lightened the sky, Helen sat on her bed staring at the photos on her phone. Evidence. Proof. Everything her father had died trying to expose. But it wasn't enough. She needed bank records, communications, witnesses willing to testify. She needed to become someone the courts would listen to, not a maid they could dismiss. And she needed to become someone Donald Versace could no longer humiliate. The next morning, Helen woke at 5 a.m., earlier than required. She changed into exercise clothes she'd kept hidden and slipped out of the estate before anyone else stirred, running through Naples's waking streets until her lungs burned and her legs trembled. Back in her room, she did bodyweight exercises, push-ups, squats, planks, using techniques she'd learned in self-defense classes years ago. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain. During her lunch break, she logged into the online law courses she'd secretly maintained, reviewing criminal procedure and evidence law. At night, after her shift ended, she studied by phone light, while her roommates slept. Maddie began bringing her proper meals, smuggled from the kitchen. Protein, vegetables, nothing like the leftover scraps the staff usually ate. "You need strength for what's coming," she'd whisper. 29 days left, 28, 27. Each morning, Helen stared at the photo of the red dress saved on her phone. But the deadline wasn't about fitting into fabric and thread. It was about being ready, physically, mentally, legally, to destroy the man who'd murdered her father and humiliated her for sport. Donald Versace thought he'd made a joke. He'd actually started a countdown to his own destruction. 3 weeks after the humiliation, Helen Morales stood differently. Not drastically. The change was subtle enough that most wouldn't notice. But her maid uniform, the same navy blue dress with white collar and apron, hung on a body that had transformed through early morning runs and disciplined training. Her shoulders sat straighter. Her movements carried quiet confidence instead of the practiced invisibility of servitude. When she carried trays now, her hands didn't tremble. Meanwhile, Donald Versace's empire was showing cracks. 2 shipments intercepted at the Naples port, $4 million in contraband seized, 3 drivers arrested. A business partner, Francesco Romano, taken into custody for money laundering, his accounts frozen. Anonymous tips flooding police stations across southern Italy, each one specific enough to be credible, vague enough to protect sources. Donald had become paranoid, snapping at staff over minor infractions, conducting impromptu security reviews of his own men. Trust, Helen observed, was the first casualty of a crumbling criminal empire. What Donald didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Helen had been feeding carefully selected information to Captain Antonio Ricci, her father's old partner in the investigative unit, the captain who'd never believed the brake failure story, who'd quietly kept Julio Morales' original case files despite orders to destroy them. Each leaked document was strategic, bank records showing unusual transfers, but not the complete network. Shipping manifests for intercepted cargo, but not upcoming operations. Enough to destabilize Donald's business, not enough to reveal the source. Helen was bleeding him slowly, watching his empire crumble one careful cut at a time. On day 22, while dusting the hallway outside Donald's private study, Helen overheard voices rising in anger. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. "Your father built this empire through respect." Marco's voice, Donald's oldest lieutenant, a man in his 50s who'd served the family for 30 years. "You're tearing it down with your ego and your recklessness. Watch your tone, Marco." Donald's voice was cold, dangerous. "I'm not my father." Exactly the problem. This was Giuseppe, younger, hungrier. "Every decision you make puts us at risk. The port seizures, Romano's arrest. The police are circling and you're too busy throwing parties and mocking servants to notice." Antonio, the quietest of the 3, spoke next. "The family council meets in 9 days. We're calling a vote. If you can't lead, we'll find someone who can." The threat hung in the air like smoke. "Is that a coup, gentlemen?" Donald's words were silk over steel. "Because my father taught me how those end." "Your father is dead," Marco said flatly. "And if you force our hand, you'll join him." Silence. Then chairs scraping, footsteps approaching the door. Helen moved quickly, continuing down the hallway with her dust cloth as if she'd heard nothing. But her mind raced. Donald's own men were planning to remove him, violently if necessary. The empire was eating itself from the inside. She could use this. Feed information to both sides, let them destroy each other while she gathered the evidence that would bury them all. Late that evening, Helen cleaned the grand hall, the marble floor where she'd been humiliated, the chandelier that had witnessed her shame. Most staff had retired. The mansion was quiet except for distant sounds of Donald's remaining security detail. She heard footsteps behind her, uneven, heavy, drunk. You. Donald's voice slurred slightly. Maid. Helen turned slowly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. Donald stood near the staircase, tie loosened, whiskey glass in hand. He looked exhausted, troubled, a far cry from the smirking showman who'd mocked her 3 weeks ago. He stared at her for a long moment, then frowned. Do I know you from somewhere? Helen's heart hammered, but her voice came out steady. I'm just a maid, Signor Versace. But something in her tone, the quiet strength, the absence of fear, made him pause. He stepped closer, studying her face with narrowed eyes that tried to pierce through alcohol and exhaustion. You look different. His eyes traveled over her. Confused. Have you lost weight? I'm taking better care of myself, sir. Helen met his gaze briefly, just long enough to hold it without submission. Someone once told me I should be ashamed of my body. I decided he was wrong. Recognition flickered across Donald's face. The memory of his cruel joke, perhaps. Or maybe just uncomfortable awareness that he was looking at a person instead of furniture for the first time. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. Helen exhaled slowly. He was starting to see her. Good. She wanted him to recognize her when the end came. At midnight, Mady burst into the servants' quarters, her face pale with fear. The other staff were asleep, but she shook Helen awake urgently. They're asking questions, Maddie whispered, her voice trembling. Marco's men. They think there's an informant in the house. Helen sat up immediately, fully alert. What kind of questions? They're reviewing security footage, interviewing staff about unusual behavior, checking phone records. Maddie's hands shook. If they find out what we've been doing, the study, the photographs, your contact with that police captain, they won't. Helen gripped Maddie's shoulders, steadying her. But inside, her mind calculated rapidly. 9 days until the family council vote. 7 days until her 30-day deadline. The timeline was collapsing. She made a decision. We accelerate everything. 30 days was always too conservative. Helen pulled out her phone, opening the folder of photographed documents. Valentina's diary, bank records, shipping manifests, communications between Donald and his father about her father's murder. Everything. Call Captain Ricci. Tell him I have everything he needs, enough to issue warrants, freeze assets, make arrests, but tell him to wait for my signal. She pulled up the photo of the crimson dress. We move when Donald sees me in this. Mady stared at the dress, then at Helen. That's in 7 days. The anniversary of the humiliation, yes. Helen's smile was cold. Donald's hosting another gala. He thinks he's celebrating survival. Instead, he'll be hosting his own downfall. What if something goes wrong? What if they find us before then? Helen touched the silver locket beneath her uniform, her father's face smiling forever. Then we go down fighting. But either way, Donald Versace's empire ends in 7 days. The countdown had become a deadline in every sense of the word. Exactly 30 days after the humiliation, the Versace estate glowed like a jewel box opened under moonlight. Donald had spared no expense for this celebration, a defiant display of power meant to prove that recent, unfortunate incidents were merely temporary setbacks. Crystal chandeliers twice the size of the previous gala's cast fractured light across marble floors. 150 guests, even more than before, filled the grand hall in designer gowns and custom suits, their jewelry catching light like scattered stars. And there, displayed prominently on its black velvet mannequin under a dedicated spotlight, hung the crimson dress. "Remember the maid challenge?" Someone laughed near the champagne fountain. Whatever happened to that poor girl? Donald, resplendent in a midnight blue suit, waved his whiskey glass dismissively. Probably quit in shame. They always do. Can't handle a little joke? His smile was sharp, cruel. At least she provided entertainment. The crowd laughed on cue, though some glances toward the dress carried discomfort. The joke had aged poorly in 30 days, taken on an edge of genuine cruelty that even jaded aristocrats found distasteful. What Donald didn't know: outside the estate gates, 5 unmarked police vehicles sat in darkness. Captain Antonio Ricci checked his watch, his tactical team silent and ready, waiting for a signal that would come from inside. What Donald also didn't know: Marco, Giuseppe, and Antonio had chosen tonight to make their move. Weapons were distributed among loyal men. The family council vote had been scheduled for the stroke of midnight, a dramatic overthrow timed to humiliate Donald before his guests. 2 factions, both planning Donald's downfall, neither aware of the third. At 10 p.m., Donald raised his glass from the base of the grand staircase, commanding attention effortlessly. The hall quieted. Cameras turned toward him. "To the Versace family!" His voice rang out, confident and powerful. "Unshakable, unbreakable, unstoppable! To the Versaces!" the crowd echoed, glasses rising. Then the grand doors opened. Silence fell like a curtain drop, so complete that the distant sound of waves against Naples's shore could be heard through open windows. Helen Morales stood in the entrance, backlit by moonlight streaming through the doorway, wearing the crimson dress. But it wasn't just the dress, though it fit her perfectly now, hugging curves that had been transformed through weeks of discipline and determination. It was the woman wearing it. Helen had shed the invisible armor of servitude completely. Her dark hair was styled in elegant waves that framed her face. Subtle makeup accentuated features that had been hidden beneath exhaustion and shame. Her posture radiated quiet, devastating power. She began to walk, slowly, deliberately, each step measured like a funeral march. Every eye tracked her movement. The cameras that had once captured her humiliation now captured something else entirely. A reckoning. Donald's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on marble with a sound like a gunshot. His face drained of color, recognition flooding his features as Helen drew closer. "You..." His voice came out strangled. "You're... the maid. You're..." Helen stopped 5 feet from him, close enough to see the confusion and growing fear in his eyes. She met his gaze directly, no longer the woman who'd kept her eyes lowered in submission. "You said you'd marry me if I fit into this dress." Her voice carried through the silent hall with perfect clarity. "But I didn't come back for marriage, Donald. I came back to give you something else. The truth." She glanced toward the back of the hall, where Maddie stood in her housekeeper's uniform, phone in hand. Their eyes met. Maddie nodded once, then pressed a button. The massive screen behind Donald, installed for tonight's celebration, meant to display family photos and tributes, lit up with different images entirely. Valentina Versace's diary entries scrolled across the screen, her elegant Italian script enlarged for all to see. A professional voiceover, Captain Ricci's, read aloud. "Donald knows what his father did to that inspector. He helped cover it up. My son has become the monster I always feared." The hall erupted in gasps. Phones lifted reflexively, capturing everything. The screen changed. Audio began playing, scratchy recordings of conversations between Donald and his late father. "The Morales problem is handled, Papa." "Good boy. Did you dispose of the brake line yourself?" "Giuseppe did it. I paid off the mechanic who inspected the car afterward." More gasps, shouts of disbelief. The crowd fractured into chaos. Bank records flashed across the screen, payments to corrupt officials, judges, police captains, shipping manifests for contraband, security footage of illegal operations. Every crime documented, time-stamped, undeniable. Donald turned to his lieutenants. "Shut it down! Cut the power! Someone—" But Marco was already moving, his weapon drawn. "This ends tonight, Donald. One way or another." Giuseppe and Antonio flanked him, their own men pulling weapons. Donald's loyal security responded in kind. The grand hall dissolved into pandemonium, guests screaming, running for exits, phones still recording everything. Then the front doors burst open. "Nobody move! Hands where we can see them!" Police tactical teams flooded the entrance, body armor, weapons raised, moving with practiced precision. Captain Ricci walked through the chaos like a man who'd waited 3 years for this moment. He stopped directly in front of Donald, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "Donald Versace, you are under arrest for murder, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and about 30 other charges we'll add as we go through the evidence." Ricci's voice was steady, professional, but his eyes held 3 years of suppressed rage. "You have the right to remain silent." Donald's eyes found Helen's, understanding finally dawning with devastating clarity. "Who are you?" Helen reached up, pulling the silver locket from beneath the dress's neckline. She opened it, showing him the photo inside. Inspector Julio Morales in his police uniform, smiling. "Inspector Julio Morales' daughter," she said quietly, each word precise as a blade. "The woman you underestimated, the daughter of the man your family murdered, and the last person you'll ever humiliate." Officers moved forward with handcuffs. Donald didn't resist. The fight had drained from him completely. As they turned him around, his eyes stayed locked on Helen's, seeing her truly for the first time. The cameras captured everything: the dress, the arrest, the empire crumbling in real time. Outside, as Donald was led to a police vehicle in handcuffs, guests scattered into the night. Marco and his conspirators were arrested alongside him. The entire operation, both factions, ended in one surgical strike. Helen stood in the grand hall as police secured the scene, still wearing the crimson dress. Mady appeared at her side, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," Mady whispered. "For your father, for my Lucia, we did it." Helen touched her locket one final time. "Yes," she said softly, "we did." The countdown was over. Justice had arrived right on schedule. 3 months after the arrest, Italian newspapers still carried the story on their front pages. Versace, crime empire collapses. Made exposes decades of corruption. From servant to savior, how Helen Morales brought down Naples' most powerful family. Justice for Inspector Morales. Daughter completes father's mission. Donald Versace awaited trial in a maximum security facility, his assets frozen, his empire dismantled piece by piece. Marco, Giuseppe, and Antonio had turned state's evidence within weeks, competing to provide testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. The Versace name, once whispered with fear and respect, had become synonymous with corruption and downfall. Helen Morales stood in a modern office on the 8th floor of a downtown Naples building, gazing through glass walls at the city her father had served and loved. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun that spoke of confidence rather than servitude. The view stretched from the historic district to the glittering bay beyond. Behind her, gold letters on the glass door read, "The Morales Justice Foundation. Legal aid for victims of organized crime." The foundation had been funded partially through recovered assets from the Versace case, blood money transformed into hope, and matched by anonymous donors who'd watched Helen's story unfold and believed in her mission. 3 lawyers, 2 investigators, and a growing staff of counselors and advocates now occupied the office space. Helen was no longer just finishing her father's work. She was building something new. The office door opened and Maddie entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, but she wasn't serving them as a subordinate. She was Helen's office manager and coordinator of victim services, dressed in professional clothes that replaced the housekeeper's uniform forever. 3 new cases today, Maddie reported, settling into the chair across from Helen's desk with the ease of an equal partner. 2 women who worked for Versace Associates, 1 man whose business was extorted for 15 years, all of them ready to testify now that the protection network is broken. They worked together now as equals, both survivors, both fighters, both women who'd transformed pain into purpose. Maddie set down her tablet, her weathered face softening. "My daughter called this morning," she said quietly. "Lucia. She's been released from that facility." Clean evaluation from independent psychiatrists. She wants to come home. Helen's professional composure cracked into a genuine smile. "Then we'll make sure she gets the therapy and support she deserves. Real support, not what they gave her. We have 3 excellent trauma counselors on retainer." "I know." Maddie's eyes filled with grateful tears. "Because you made sure of it. For Lucia. For all of them." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 women who'd started in servants' quarters and ended in an office that bore a murdered man's name. That afternoon, Helen's assistant brought in the day's mail. 1 envelope stood out, prison postmark, familiar handwriting. Helen stared at Donald Versace's name on the return address. She almost threw it away unopened. Almost. But curiosity won. The letter was surprisingly honest, written in the careful script of someone with nothing but time. "Helen, I've had nothing but time to think, to remember, to see the monster I became. You didn't just destroy my empire. You made me face what I'd turned into. Every day in this cell I watch that video of my mother's diary entries, her words about failing to save my soul." She was right. My mother would be ashamed of what I became. My father made me this way, taught me that power meant cruelty, that fear was respect. But I chose to stay that way. I chose to mock you that night. I chose to cover up your father's murder. If I ever leave this place and my lawyers say I won't for at least 20 years, I won't rebuild what I lost. I'll try to become who I should have been, the son my mother wanted, the man who deserved the empire he inherited. But I know that doesn't matter to you. You didn't do this for my redemption. You did it for justice, and you were right to. Donald. Helen read it once, carefully, then folded it and placed it in a file labeled Versace Case Correspondence. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just documentation. Some transformations came too late to matter. The following week, Helen returned to the Versace estate, now government property awaiting auction, its opulent rooms empty and echoing. She walked through the grand hall one final time, her footsteps on marble carrying different weight now. The chandeliers were dark, the champagne fountain silent, but the mannequin still stood in the center of the room, and on it, carefully preserved, hung the crimson dress. Helen approached it slowly, remembering the woman who'd stood here 3 months ago with tears burning her eyes. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime. She carefully removed the dress, folding it with the same precision she'd once used folding linens in servants' quarters. Back at the foundation office, she had it displayed in a glass case in the lobby, visible to every client who walked through their doors. A brass plaque beneath read, "This dress was meant to humiliate. Instead, it became armor. May every woman who sees it remember, you define yourself, no one else." On a bright Saturday morning, Helen stood in the Naples Police Department headquarters in a renovated office on the 3rd floor. The brass plaque beside the door read, "The Inspector Julio Morales Memorial Room." Inside, her father's old desk had been restored. His citations and commendations lined one wall, and in the center, in a place of honor, Helen carefully placed his badge in a frame beside his photo, the same photo from her locket. Inspector Julio Morales smiled forever, proud in his uniform, unaware of how his daughter would finish what he'd started. Captain Ricci appeared in the doorway, older now, the weight of 3 years of partnership visible in the lines around his eyes. "He'd be proud of you," Ricci said quietly. Helen touched the frame gently, her fingers tracing the outline of her father's face. "I know." She turned, meeting Ricci's eyes with calm certainty. "And I'm finally proud of myself, too." She walked out of the memorial room, through the police station where her father had worked for 20 years, and into Naples' sunlight. Free, strong, victorious. Not because she'd destroyed Donald Versace, but because she'd rebuilt everything he'd tried to take from her. They tried to break her with a dress and laughter, but Helen Morales turned humiliation into power, shame into strength, and revenge into justice. Donald Versace thought he was untouchable, that wealth and cruelty made him invincible. But he forgot one thing: never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the gun or the money. It's the one with the truth, and the courage to make the world listen.